And we, on the left and right, all of us, and the sort of non-political, need to basically be, I think, guarding our souls a little bit. And the reason I bring this up with reference to conservatism is that I think that there are some very concerning trends. And you see it maybe emboldened with Trump's victory. There's a kind of casual cruelty that is increasingly celebrated. And so I think it's a mimetic reaction. And they might say it's justified. This is just a mirror image of what the left has been doing to us. We're now going to do to them, or whatever. But this is corrupting your soul. And at a certain point, whether or not you're right doesn't matter nearly so much as whether you're good. And so I think there's real moral peril that is facing people on all sides here that we need to be more tuned to.
Concepts with Shawn Whatley.
All right, really excited to have Caylan Ford with us today. She is a documentary filmmaker, a writer, a researcher, charter school founder. She's actually founded 3 schools now, and a former political candidate. She's studied Chinese history at the University of Calgary. She has a master's in international affairs from George Washington University. She has a second master's in international human rights law from the University of Oxford. She's worked as a senior policy advisor on and off for Canada's foreign ministry for 10 years. But I think most of her time now is spent with these 3 schools that she's just started. Welcome, Caylan.
Thank you for having me, Shawn.
Great. So I've been asking everybody about what does the word conservative mean, but just before the show, you said, let's start with, why does anything matter? Why did you want to start with such a fundamental question?
I just like starting from first principles. And it's also a segue to get into what I really want to talk about, which is what are the ultimate, not just earthly, but final ends towards which we and our political leaders should be oriented. So I think that I really like how Walker Percy puts this question. I think it's in The Moviegoer. He says something like, I'm not really sure what we're doing on this insignificant cinder spinning away in a dark corner of the universe. And that is at least how it appears. I think appearances can be deceptive in terms of what is the metaphysical significance of this world. But that's where we are. And I think if you start there, it becomes very interesting to ask the question, why do people get so animated about politics or about anything? Because I think when you take that vantage point, you remember that all we are and all that we strive for and expend our nerves worrying about day after day, all is going to revert to dust in what is in the sort of timescale of the cosmos, not even the blink of an eye. Why should we care? And I think that the only coherent answer has to be that there is actually, we have souls that endure eternally, and that this world is not actually just a sort of insignificant cinder. It is something more akin to a place of transformation, a place of pilgrimage. And this has certainly been the view for many centuries, for millennia. And I think the concern about, for most of history at least, we've been concerned about trying to apprehend what is the eternal fate of mankind and how do we structure our politics and our laws accordingly. Metaphysical questions are no longer part of our public discourse. And I think that accounts for some of the incoherence of our public sphere. So that's why I wanted to start there.
You mentioned that we're not allowed to ask metaphysical questions. Let's just focus on the practical application of how do we get clean water for this community? How do we get roads that aren't full of potholes? Do you think we should forget about the roads, forget about the water, and just focus on the heavens?
No, I think they go together. I think there's sort of 2 broad categories of goods that we should be focused on, human and divine. And the latter takes precedence. But I think that when you're properly oriented in that respect, you're going to have the human flourishing dimension covered as well. I think if you focus exclusively on the sort of the immanent material world to the exclusion of human spiritual needs and sort of the needs of the soul, I think that then you will not achieve either.
Oh, great answer. I'm scribbling notes. You mentioned immanent and you mentioned souls eternal. I'm thinking, okay, she likes Plato. Were you riffing off Plato there, or did you have something else in mind?
Yes, I was riffing off Plato a little bit, actually quite overtly plagiarizing from Plato on the 2 categories of goods with which laws should be concerned. No, but Vogelin obviously had this insight as well. Vogelin was a great fan of Plato and very profoundly inspired by him. And I think one of Vogelin's insights is that there's a huge variety of what can be considered well-ordered, harmonious human societies. So there's not only one way to do a good society, but all good, harmonious, ordered, just societies are going to endeavor to attune themselves to certain transcendent laws, let's say. Call it the Tao, call it natural law, whatever. The more in accord a society is with these sort of actual eternal standards which exist above mankind, the more likely it is to be flourishing, to enjoy longevity, and to be a kind of environment in which people can usually seek eternal ends as well. When a society is not ordered in accord with, I'm going to say reality, and I don't mean by that the kind of disenchanted reality. I think the term is often abused to be set in contrast to like idealism. That's a misuse of both terms. So reality actually being full of enchantment, having some kind of transcendent source. If a society is not in accord with reality, basically if it's built on lies or a very shabby metaphysical foundation, you're going to need a lot of, I'm going to say, violence to maintain it, because it is not in accord with human nature or any other kind of nature. And I think this sort of the preservation of lies requires a great deal of force. When I say violence or force, I don't necessarily mean like the state is beating people in the streets. I also mean, for example, interventions by powerful social, economic, or other technologies that don't allow us to experience what would be a natural feedback loop.
Gosh, so many.
Do you understand what I'm, does that make sense what I'm referring to there?
Absolutely. So telos seeking reality versus idealism, and then also technological, I was thinking technological society. So there's so many jumping off points. Even before we jump into all those different topics, I wanted to ask you, how can we be sure that we have the right faculties, the right abilities to perceive what you're talking about? So it seems like we can get a hint of it, but it also seems that we're doomed to never fully know this thing that we're aware of. And while you're thinking of an answer to that, I can, if it's not.
I'm on the edge of my seat.
Oh, you are?
Give you an
Okay,
answer.
jump in.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, you go ahead. Finish the thought.
So I was going to say that I was just talking with John von Hiking a few days ago, and he's got me into David Walsh on personalism. His ideas around the person, he explains how unintelligible Descartes' "I think, therefore I am" is, because who's the I who's thinking? And so he talks about how the profoundness of persons, not individuals, not selves, persons, how profound that concept is. And when you try to examine the person, it's continually escaping from the edge of your perception. And yet we have to try to unpack what persons are, or we're left with a very empty, shallow, superficial, unreal policy environment. So I'm going to stop there, and I don't know if anything I've said resonates with what you were trying to say.
I don't know if this book is on your radar.
Hold it up a little.
So it's David Bentley Hart's.
Yeah, David.
So one of the tricky philosophical problems that he's trying to address here is he's attacking a Cartesian dualism, the idea that there's matter over here and then there's the immaterial, the soul or the spirit, or the idea that kind of comes out of this sometimes that we are akin to a sort of, there's a ghost in the machine, right? There's an immaterial thing possessing our physical bodies. But this doesn't really work because immaterial, how does the immaterial interface with the material? How does it command it? Or vice versa. How does if you take a purely materialist view of the cosmos and you say there is no soul, and these things that we think of as our thoughts, our intentionality, the soul, actually these are just at root, just purely mechanical or chemical processes. And it only gives the appearance of being animate. So this book is an attack on this whole idea. And I think that what he's trying to get at is the idea that actually the universe is, first, it is more mind. And that matter is perhaps a kind of emergent expression of mind. But that these things actually do share a substrate. They're not two completely different kinds of things. And anyway, it's very good. It's David Bentley Hart's All Things Are Full of Gods.
Yeah. So another a fancy term I like to throw around, it makes me sound smart, but the supervenient epiphenomenon, where the reality of the individual, the person, is just this epiphenomenon that floats above the material synapses of your brain and the chemistry of your brain. And I say it as a joke, but yet a lot of people believe that. Certainly my background in science and technology, where people say, yeah, no, that's just, it's a dream that you're talking about when you talk about anything beyond the material.
Oh, you'd ask the question, how do we know that we are actually qualified to apprehend something about the nature of reality? And this is a really great question. And this is, I think, why I'm interested in education. So when I'm being very candid and people ask why I started schools, I want students to be rooted in reality, again, by that actually a fully enchanted, alive reality, and to maintain their openness to transcendence. I think there are many forces in the modern world that conspire to cut us off from the divine. So how do we apprehend it? I think this comes from one disciplined practice of virtues. I think that we're only qualified we're much more likely to be able to accurately apprehend the workings of the cosmos, its underlying laws and qualities, when we are more in tune with it already. So I think there's a mutually reinforcing phenomenon there. But then I think that there's also experiences, what Vogelin borrows a term from Alfie Bergson. He talks about the opening of the soul. And this might be also referred to as the divine nous, right? That the divine intuition. So it's not the purely rational kind of left hemisphere part of our brain that's operating and thinking. There's an openness there, and I think it comes in moments of silent receptivity. I don't know if you've ever had this experience. I think a lot more people have than we talk about. But I certainly have had, I think, a number of them, which I attribute to my being quite dense, and I've needed some help, I think, along the way in my life. But moments when I basically felt as if my mind was cracked open and some insight poured into it. And it's not something that seemed to have been generated from my own consciousness. It wasn't a product of rational deliberation. It was that sort of opening of the soul to some transcendent reality, which, if one were to try to describe it, is purely good, it's just, it is true. It's an experience of what some people might call like a kind of experience of God in a way. And one of the preconditions for moments like that, I don't think it's necessarily a matter of desserts. I certainly didn't deserve this insight when it came to me, I don't think. But I think that a precondition is silence. You have to be able to enter into a state of relative inner stillness, of contemplation, but not even active contemplation. So I think it's a state of silent receptivity. And if you don't have the capacity for that, you will never hear the voice of the divine. It will not have room to enter into your life. For me, those moments tended to come in a sort of abyss of despair, where I had almost given up actively seeking for answers and had resigned myself. And it's in that silence, in that abyss, that I think real insight comes. And we've done so much to crowd out silence in the modern world. I think we're very uncomfortable with it. In many ways, we should probably have more opportunities for silence than our ancestors did. We don't live in super close quarters in cities anymore, but people constantly have earbuds in. They listen to white noise even when they're going to sleep. They're filling their days with stimulation.
When you mentioned developing the capacity for silence and the capacity for receptivity, it reminded me of Aristotle talking about the development of intellectual virtue and how that takes energy and time and effort. You actually have to work at that a bit. And he also distinguishes that from developing moral virtue or a moral second nature. And so you're not born courageous. You have to do things that require courage, and eventually you'll develop a courageous character. And so there's the development of a second nature. And I think it also applies to, I'm asking you, might it also apply to your comments about silence? And then also, as you're doing that, though, I wanted you to throw out a definition of transcendence.
I'll try. A definition of transcendence is tough because you're asking to define something that is ineffable. A non-inspiring definition that I could give is it's non-contingent. So all earthly things are contingent, right? All matter our lives, all of our possessions. Our interaction here today is time-bound. So what is outside of the contingent? What is the sort of fundamental substrate on which all of this sits? And then your question, do we need to actively cultivate those different natures? Yes. At the school, actually, we have on our report card 2 categories. We distinguish between the intellectual virtues and the moral virtues. So intellectual virtues could be things like docility, which again, a term that is often misused, doesn't just mean meekness. Docility is your openness to being taught. Whether students ask deep questions, their depth of inquiry, their spirit of philosophical wonder, habits of diligence, these things are examples of intellectual virtues, or at least will lead to the acquisition of intellectual virtues. And then the moral virtues are, they have to be practiced. So courage is an example, and we do a lot of instruction on moral virtues using an Aristotelian framework. So the idea that we're seeking a kind of golden mean. So an excess of courage is like rashness, a deficiency is a sort of pusillanimity or excessive meekness. So that's a lot of the language that we try to use with the children when it comes to discipline or helping them identify areas for improvement. Those virtues have to be practiced. And I think a huge part of that, and actually when I've been asked to try to define what is our vision for a graduate, what do we hope to achieve with our students? If I were to narrow it down to a single thing, I would say, are they capable of finding stillness in their souls? Can they retire into themselves in times of tribulation and difficulty and find refreshment there? And this is a proxy for so many other things. One, this I think is the truest form of freedom. I think of Boethius and the Consolations of Philosophy and this idea that actually human freedom is non-contingent. It doesn't have to depend on the physical environment in which you find yourself. You could be wrongfully sentenced to prison and yet in your heart still be free because you live with a clear conscience. It suggests that the students will have furnished their inner worlds beautifully, that there are things that they can go to, internal resources that they can rely on. But it also implies that they have to have practiced moral virtues. Otherwise, they would find that being alone with themselves is intolerable. I think the more kind of attachments that we have, the more we're driven by the sort of pursuit of self-interest and anxieties about what's going to happen to us, the more unpleasant it becomes to be still inside ourselves. And if you have that stillness, it suggests that you've cultivated these prerequisites to it. But I do want to get back. I want to talk about, why do we not talk about this in our politics? And why is the sort of the numinous realms or the supernatural or the ultimate ends of human life, why have these been relegated to the margins of our consciousness? And one obvious answer is that this is a function of the kind of liberal public square, by which liberals would say it's a value-neutral public square, right? And this obviously served certain sort of positive historic purposes. When you look at this sort of wars of religion that ravaged Europe for centuries, ideas of just saying, look, to each his own, you practice your own religious beliefs, the state is not going to try to centrally enforce them, we're going to try to maintain a neutral public square. This makes sense in that context. But in a certain way, I wonder if it no longer addresses the main challenges that we face very well. And I think one of the corollaries is, of course, it's not neutral. Nothing is neutral. But when you say, look, questions of ultimate concern, things like, who are we? Why are we alive? What is the meaning of a good life? Where do we go after death? These are really fundamental questions. And when you say, actually, no, those don't belong in the public sphere, these are merely private questions, you are making a very loaded value statement about what is important. You're saying that these things are actually secondary concerns, and the public sphere is concerned only with life, liberty, and property. So your bare biological existence, your life, your material accretion, your freedom, and of course freedom is then liable to be misinterpreted to mean something like license or the ability to do whatever you want without restraint, right? Which is again a misuse of the term. So I think in that historic context it makes sense why, but the consequence is that you have a triumph of triviality. Peter Berger used this term when you've cast aside the metaphysical questions. And I think that another reason maybe why we don't talk about this very much, is that we've forgotten death. I think we have a very disordered relationship with our own mortality. We have hidden it from ourselves so thoroughly. And I think there's a lot of consequences attached to this. And what I mean is, one, we don't have mass calamities in the West, or at least for a couple generations now, right? So no actually really deadly plagues or major wars that large portions of our young male population get enlisted into. Child and maternal mortality rates are a tiny fraction of what they were even 100 years ago. And in many ways, these are things for which we should be grateful. And I don't mean that as a throwaway comment. I actually mean it. I think these are good things. But everything is a trade-off. And I think one of the consequences of this is it has allowed us to limit our sort of temporal sphere of concern to a single lifetime. When we're not reminded of death, I don't think we contemplate as much what is the eternal fate of the soul. And of course, we do still die, but even when we die now, it's usually in a sort of environment that is away from us. We hide the fact of death. So most people don't die in the home. They die in long-term care centers, in hospitals. We don't butcher our own animals, right? So you've never looked at the face of the animal that you're eating. You just buy its flesh in a cellophane wrapped carton from the grocery store. And in all these ways, we've used medical and social technologies to conceal the unpleasant fact of mortality. And as a consequence, I don't think we're able to give life its proper due.
Since you ended on death, I thought we could connect that. Again, an idea that I was asking John about, John von Hiking. And because you like Vogelin, a Vogelinian word is metaxy, which is actually a word from Plato. So this idea of our human experience as being caught between two things, between life and death, between truth and untruth, perfection, imperfection. So there's a whole bunch of things that we're continually in tension between. And if we don't embrace that tension, if we aren't aware of that metaxy, there's a tendency to hypostasize either end of that tension, which can lead to extraneous passion or nihilism. So we become political activists or we become addicted to Netflix. So neither of them are evidence of a well-ordered life, a well-ordered soul. I'm wondering whether or not you had that in mind when you're talking about this overemphasis on life, and we're not talking about death.
I think that's a closely related concept, but I won't claim that I was thinking of it actively. But there's a quote that I just found that I was looking for. I alluded to Peter Berger, who's a sociologist of the best kind, and he suggests that this sort of closing our eyes to eternity, or the attempt to relegate the fact of our mortality to the margins of our consciousness, has the consequence that, he says, the reality of a middle-aged businessman drowsily digesting his lunch is elevated to the status of final philosophical authority. All questions that don't correspond to this reality are ruled inadmissible. The denial of metaphysics must here be identified with the triumph of triviality. So that's what I was referencing there. But and I think that the imbalance that you just described, we can see it. And one of the ways that it's very obvious, and here maybe brings us a little bit more into the connection to current events. One of the ways where it's really obvious is the plummeting birth rates all over the world. I think that this has something to do with the fact that we no longer encounter death. Because when you're reminded of mortality, it is, again, I think it is another signal of transcendence. I like to think that there are three primary ways that a human being will have these kind of numinous experiences or encounters with some kind of other sort of reality than what seems to lie right before us. One of those is experiences of sublime beauty. And I think a lot of people will say that it's the shock of extraordinary beauty seems to bring them in connection with something beyond the mundane day-to-day. Another, as I said, is just silence, or at least that's a condition required for the others. But the last is profound suffering, experiences of death or of little deaths within life that come from deep loss, because they remind us of the contingent nature of our lives, of the sort of finitude of all of these things. And they force us to then think about the non-contingent elements, about the permanent things. I think they force us to ask, all right, my reputation, fame, material wealth, my relationships, all of this can be taken from me in an instant. This, of course, is that Solzhenitsyn expressed this beautifully, that all can be taken in one fell night, right? I had a very similar experience to that, of all of this being taken from me in the span of about 4 hours when I was running for political office. But one of the things that those experiences really does remind you of is that this world is a kind of exile from our true homes, that this is not our final destiny or sort of the final fate of our souls. And it focuses us to think about the lasting things. So when you don't have encounters with profound suffering, with mortality, with loss, I think you just don't think very much about the future. As I said, I think it narrows your temporal framework to be very constrained to the present. And I don't think that you're then thinking about what is your legacy. So one of the things that death reminds you of is that, oh, maybe I should try to leave something behind. And having children is, I think Aristotle described it as, it's attenuated immortality. The point of having children is actually, it is a form of immortality. There's other ways to maybe access immortality, but we'll just think about that one because that's the one that's available most readily to most of us. So if you're not thinking about death, I don't think that you're thinking very much about future life or about the duties that you may bear to posterity or what you're leaving behind.
Yeah, brilliant. I wanted to say I apologize too for asking you for a definition of transcendence. Louis Armstrong, I believe, said when asked for a definition of jazz, he said, if you need to ask me for a definition of jazz, you're never going to understand jazz. So I guess that I will never understand transcendence. But I wanted to pick up on a couple threads that you've identified here. You asked a profound question. Why are we not allowed to ask metaphysical questions? I think part of the reason they stopped asking those questions is because A, they thought they weren't practical enough, like we said earlier about making roads, getting clean water. And even more importantly, they worried that they caused people to fight. I think our fear of that is what encourages or pushes the public square to become just focused on policy with no focus, and not even no focus, antigens towards these more profound questions. Now, have I overstated things by saying people are running away from them because it's a fear of war, or is that a bit ridiculous?
No, I think that's fair, except that I don't know how many people would say explicitly it's a fear of war, but I think that I like the term the antigens, but I think they've been socialized in a context where certain ideas are associated with, rightly or wrongly, with forces that led to cataclysms, right? It is curious, even the idea of a defensive national culture that is inward-looking, that wishes to preserve its own customs and mores and exercise sort of self-determination. This gets associated with Nazism, even though Nazism was actually not. And I think it's because Hitler wrapped himself in this cloak of national self-determination in order to justify what clearly was not at all about that, right? So are we worried about that? Yes, I think so. And then I think it's also that now people are allergic to the idea that anyone would impose upon them a vision of the good. My friend Bruce Party very emphatically argues, who says anyone who has an idea of what is the common good is basically a tyrant who would impose their morality on me. Now, I think that this is, with respect to Bruce, for whom I have endless personal affection, I think this is just a very naive understanding of how human societies work. There has to be a common culture. You're not capable of any kind of cooperative undertakings or of living in a society if you don't have some agreement on the goods to which you're oriented. Problem is just the only goods towards which we seem to be oriented are GDP and I don't know what else, and the ability to destroy all natural limitations so that we can enact our will with greater freedom. I don't know.
We tend to be in love with what can be quantified, as long as quantity and certainty. So I'm glad you went to common good, because we mentioned contentless, we mentioned value neutral. I want to read one quote for you. So this is Yoram Hazony. I was listening to him on a podcast the other day. And I wouldn't call myself a national conservative. I do read his books and I've liked what he said, but this one comment he made I thought was profound. I won't read the whole thing. And he said, people aren't having babies, and why is that? And he said, we need to have people to buy into what's accepted as good and normal in your society. And if people don't understand that anymore, if they don't know what is expected of them to do, they'll stop doing it. And he said this, quote, not every single person, but society-wide. A few people will have a fantastic time, but the great majority stop being willing to take risks. They stop being willing to get married. They stop being willing to have children. They stop being willing to start companies, to put themselves out to do great things, because the guide rails that told them what kinds of things and the social feedback that honored them when they did them, like getting married and having children, they've been crushed. They've been crushed by the false view that if you tell the individual, be free and make all your own decisions, then they will be free and make all their own decisions. They don't. They stop. They stop being human, end quote. Your thoughts?
That's great. Oh, that's excellent. I think it is a terrible burden to lay on someone to say, I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to provide any signposts, any cultural scripts, any guardrails. You need to be self-making. You need to invent for yourself the meaning of life. I think that there are certain people, maybe people possessed of extraordinary creativity or cognitive gifts, or extremely rational people, who may find that liberating. And as you said, who may have a great time. And I think this is much of what the Enlightenment was about, insofar as the Enlightenment was about the rejection of inherited prejudices, customs, norms. These things are experienced as oppressive by a certain class of people. Again, that's generally a kind of class possessed of extraordinary cognitive capabilities and capacities. And so they said, okay, we would like to free ourselves from the shackles of tradition and be able to do what we want, and everyone else should enjoy the same. But this is a terrible thing to do to people. The culture, there's a reason why culture shares etymological roots with the ideas of plant growing, right? It's cultivation. You're cultivating plants. You need a culture, and you need let's say, culture is a loam in which you take root. And if you have a rich soil in which to plant yourself, you're able to draw nourishment from the wisdom of previous generations. You have embedded within you a certain telos, right? What kind of seed you are determines what kind of plant you will grow into. There is actually a direction and a purpose to your life. And if you have a rich soil and you have that kind of nutrients, you have an internal direction, you will grow into something that will flourish. To take the analogy further, you will be able to be creative. You'll give shade to others. You'll have usefulness to your society. You'll bear fruits. So I can take the analogy pretty far, but I think what liberalism said is, no, to take roots, to be rooted, is oppressive. You should never take root anywhere, because then you're stuck there, right? So you should be hypermobile and uprooted. And you don't want to start growing, because then you'll have a fixed direction, right? You don't want to have to make decisions that will commit you to a particular path, like getting married or having children or something. That will oppress you too. You want to stay maximally free and unencumbered. So don't take root. Don't start growing in a given direction. And then you'll be free. You can just float around, and you can be lofted up to the heavens, and you can get washed down in streams. But this doesn't sound great to me, because actually what that means is that you remain a sort of inert seed, totally atomized, without any connections, and you will be extremely easy to manipulate, because there's nothing that stands between you and the elements. Any force that wants to exert itself on you will be free to do, and you'll have no resistance. So this condition of the mass atomized man, who is totally uprooted from time, from place, from intergenerational or communal relations, from the great web of mutual interdependency that characterizes life in a society. The person who's totally uprooted from this is the ideal subject for totalitarianism, because they have no buffer at all. They have no ability to orient themselves with respect to even what is true. How do I discern just from unjust, beauty from ugliness? So yes, so Hannah Arendt uses the term of mass atomized man. This is what totalitarianism wants. It's what it tries to produce.
So when you hear the good, I think we both worry about an arbitrary good, a good that is divorced from reality. And I think when you're talking about telos, you're talking about what we see around us. Babies are born, babies grow up, babies need food and shelter and water. These are all the good things that you and I think have in mind, at least as a start. And so when we're talking about the good, we're not talking about an arbitrary list of religious rules that we're going to come in and legislate and turn Parliament into a debate about medieval fine points of doctrinal theology. That's not what we're talking about. Have you been able to parse out how do we avoid an arbitrary telos, an arbitrary good that we're aiming for, describing the true, the good, and the beautiful as things that are inherent as part of reality around us? And that's what we're actually aiming for when you talk about a common good, with the admission that we don't ever have the capacity to fully define the true, the good, and the beautiful. And it's a lifelong search. Was that a way to decrease the anxiety people feel when we start talking about telos and common good? Because some people
Yeah.
really get violently upset when
Oh,
you
yeah.
even mention the comment.
Yeah. And I appreciate that inclination. And I think it's partly because they perceive that the people who are pursuing kind of ideological projects of social or communal salvation, they'd say these people also have an idea of the good. Now, I will dispute that I don't think that they're actually oriented toward reality. What they're doing is not what Vogelin says is the philosopher is engaged in a loving endeavor to apprehend the order of being and attune his soul to it. They're doing the opposite. They're saying actually reality is disordered and we need to seize control so that we can reshape it and perfect it. These are totally different things. So I disagree that these are actually the same. So let's get to that idea of what is the philosophical undertaking, which is to apprehend the order of being and attune our souls to it. This is predicated on the idea that the order of being, that these kind of transcendent truths, there are actually standards of justice, of beauty, of goodness. These are out there, and we possess a capacity to know it, not fully. And that's a really important caveat. None of us can ever achieve perfect knowledge of the truth. I think there are innumerable levels to it. We probably all remain on a very low rung of that ladder, but it is out there, and we are rational animals, and we have an ability to discern some aspect of it. So we should proceed in that undertaking with humility, with an understanding that there are limits to our knowledge and our wisdom. Our ignorance is always, by definition, infinite. Our knowledge always finite. So we should be humble in that sense. And I think not too dogmatic in our approach to things. But the fact that we can never achieve perfect knowledge of truth, it's a good reason for humility. It is not a good reason to throw up your arms and say, I guess we shouldn't bother trying, right? Everyone go make your own meaning. You're basically saying there is no truth. Go figure it out for yourself and invent it. And it's totally fungible and subjective and varies from person to person. And then a common life is impossible. There are several different paths to truth. One is revealed religion. And I think this makes people nervous when you suggest that you would order your society based on religious precepts or revelation. But there's other ways that we can apprehend this truth too. And one is just by kind of simple observation of the human condition. And we can actually tell there's certain ways of living that produce greater happiness than others. And I don't mean happiness as a passing aesthetic sense of pleasure, a kind of lasting happiness. And there's certain ways of living that do not conduce to happiness. And actually we can apprehend and discern between these things if we were only to try. And I don't think that we try very hard to do it. And this is what I was referring to earlier. We have all sorts of social technologies that interfere with our ability to discern those things, because we've cut off what would normally be the kind of natural feedback loops and consequences that should signal to us this is not something we want to be doing. As a simple example, massive taxation and redistribution of wealth is a form of arresting these signals so that we can't actually apprehend what works, what doesn't work, because we're going to try to level things regardless of how people are living. Especially elements of tax codes that are always criticized, that seem to incentivize choices that actually we may not want to be incentivizing, that don't actually make people happy. And I think there's so many of these in all spheres of life. So I think part of it is just we need to recommit ourselves to saying that our project should actually be to figure out what is true, what is the nature of reality, and how can we come as close as we can with humility and with appropriate caution and prudence to attune our society to that.
Brilliant. I wanted to jump on what you said about revealed religion. Look at Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson is a Jungian, right? I'm not an expert on Carl Jung or Freud, but I think the 20th century, we became practical Freudians. And I would say Freud was not just a psychiatrist, he was a metaphysician. He would say it's all about materialism, and anyone who has thoughts of spirituality or something immaterial is proof of mental illness. That would be Freud's take on things. You and I are both mentally unwell. Whereas Carl Jung said, I don't agree with throwing out all these anthropological narrative myths. So these stories that we find in cultures all around the world. And apparently Carl Jung became very interested in them. And not with a view to saying that they are true. And so this is where I would disagree with them. But it's not something I bring into the public square. Carl Jung would say the concept of myth and spirit are essential to the human experience. And it seems like Jordan Peterson and others have really tapped into that felt need amongst the populace where people have a sense that there's something more that needs to be talked about that we're not allowed to talk about in the public square. And so I think that's part of Peterson's success. He's really tapped into something that we've ignored for all of modernity. We're practical Freudians. We're like, no, that's evidence of mental illness, so we're not even going to go there. Do you have any thoughts on that?
This is I think you asked before we started recording the podcast if I have a book that I've published or working on. I've pivoted from some other writing projects, and I'm trying now to figure out a way to write about this, and it's very challenging. So I was at a little event in the fall. It was maybe 20 people, and it was a seminar, and we were focused on the concept of beauty, the sort of philosophical concept of beauty. And at one point, the facilitator asked the question, said, I've never asked this before, but how many of you have had an experience of, I think he maybe said, the sublime or the supernatural? And about half the people in the room raised their hands. And I think that a huge portion of the population actually is having these kind of numinous experiences that psychotherapists would say are indicative of a psychopathology of schizophrenia or something, so we don't talk about them. But maybe half of us have had these, and yet we don't talk about it. And I think that does something. I think the effect on us is that it diminishes our integrity, by which actually the integration of the different components of ourselves. So when you go to work and you talk with your friends and you pretend that you care about the marginal tax rate or whatever, but you're actually having these really significant kind of numinous experiences over here, this leads to a sort of fractured state. And so I'm trying to figure out if there's a way that I can write about, bridge this gap between the mundane and the numinous realms, and actually write intelligibly about experiences of the supernatural. So that's my current project, and it is very challenging.
Wow, very
Yeah.
cool. Have you read Ian McGilchrist?
My laptop is sitting on the 2 volumes of his most recent work, The Matter with Things, not very far.
I've got his Master and Emissary on the shelf behind me, and I've read 10 pages of it. Have you listened to him on podcasts? It seems okay. Do you like what he says? And
yeah, absolutely. But
Yeah.
I'm not even going to attempt to summarize for your audience, because
No.
it's pretty mentally taxing for me to get through 5 pages of his book in one sitting. Yeah,
Well,
I haven't assimilated it.
My impression of him, and I will be silly about it and try to summarize him, he has used the language of the materialists to prove the poverty of materialism. And I think it's brilliant, right? So it's like he's using reason to disprove rationalism. He's using material evidence to disprove materialism as an all-encompassing philosophy. I really enjoy his approach. I just think you're just a little stinker in turning it against the teacher. It's like he's asking questions in class that you're not supposed to ask. And so I think he's brilliant. I wanted to pick up on your comment about beauty, and I'm trying to figure out a way, how can we land this discussion? But you mentioned beauty, and I thought of Roger Scruton. He's famous for writing about aesthetics. And Scruton said that conservatism is a politics of rescue, and it arises in response to crisis. So the most classic example is when we see people becoming very articulate about conservative ideas in response to the French Revolution. Now, to be clear, they weren't inventing these ideas then. They were pointing to authors and writers and thinkers that predate the French Revolution, but they were coming and bringing them out and saying, oh, no, this is who we are. We aren't these radical people who just chop off heads and tear down structures. This is who we are, especially in Britain. And I'm convinced, at least I think I'm seeing this in Canada, but also across North America, where there's a renaissance in conservative philosophy, in people wanting to rediscover this anew as we've come to the end of this post-war liberal era. Even people who say, oh, you sound like a post-liberal, I ask them, does it feel the same today as it did in 2005, right? And so I'm wondering whether you would agree that conservatism is going through a bit of a renaissance. People are looking for language to describe some of their innate or instinctive conservative tendencies. And then finally, to close with, what is Caylan Ford's definition of conservative when it comes to Canadian politics?
All right. So I think the first is we talked a lot about how the modern era, and this I think comes out of all situated 17th century especially, is obsessed with quantification. And we don't really have the vocabulary anymore to talk about the ineffable goods. But I think in many ways conservatism is concerned with those, with things that can't be quantified, measured, and can't be bought and sold. Or at least conservatism should be concerned with those. So things like beauty in our built environments. There's nothing at all conservative about building terrible, ugly, disposable buildings. This is a kind of psychic violence that is imposed on the citizenry. And again, of course, we have to have a conception of what is the good and what is beautiful if we're to resist this. Otherwise, we're just going to live in ugly places. Another good, obviously, is the good of family. This is where, again, I just loathe the national daycare policy, and I could talk about that ad nauseum. It is, again, it's about saying that human beings we're homo economicus, we exist to fuel GDP growth. Never mind that the actual costs of this program are enormous, and they will never be offset by the added taxes that women pay when they re-enter the workforce a couple of years earlier than planned. So these are actually just more costs that we're imposing on these children, who will bear the cost down the road, in addition to the psychosocial costs that they will endure by being put in institutional daycares from the most tender ages. So we know that this kind of program is bad for children. Time spent in institutional daycares is almost always correlated with much worse psychosocial and academic outcomes, and these outcomes persist through decades. So this is a lifelong impact. It's bad because it diminishes the informal bonds of civil society. When you can have daycare subsidized in a center-based daycare, but not when your mom is babysitting, you're going to use the center-based daycare. It imposes opportunity costs on every woman who chooses not to do it. It is basically telling everyone, actually, the normative ideal is the dual income trap, and you should all be in that situation. There's nothing conservative about this at all. There's nothing conservative about reducing human beings to GDP contributions. This is anti-human. And I think at root, conservatism, to borrow a phrase from Russell Kirk, should be about keeping humanity human. This is another, I think, point of tension, though, that's coming out on the right. And Elon Musk is the personification of it. He's not conservative at all, right? I think it's a matter of strange historical contingencies that he's aligned with Trump. I don't think Trump is all that conservative either. But I think conservatism, in some ways, is about, yes, let us apprehend the order of being, the laws of the cosmos, and in a spirit of sort of humility and love and gratitude, attune our souls to it. And part of that requires an acceptance that there are certain natural limitations that come with that. Moral law imposes limitations on us. Our biology imposes limitations on us. We will die, right? These are not evils. This is just our condition. And there is a kind of transhumanist aspiration that is present on the left and the right in different ways, because it's basically just an outgrowth of liberal theology that says, no, all involuntary compacts, obligations, limitations that we don't freely consent to are illegitimate, and we need to destroy them. And we destroy them in various ways by dismantling customs, norms, prejudices. We dismantle them through our mastery of techne, through technology. We try to destroy these limitations. We don't like the limitations of biology, so we try to use technology to overcome biology, to even overcome our mortality. There's just nothing more hubristic than this, and so more destined to a terrible calamity in the end. And I think it's important for conservatives to draw a line there and say, actually, no, machine-based surrogacy or any kind of surrogacy or IVF or all of these things that we do in an attempt to fundamentally alter nature are actually destroying nature, and we need to oppose them as conservatives. Charles Taylor has an interesting way of conceptualizing, again, this is the modern versus pre-modern view of man. And the modern view is what I think Taylor calls the buffered self, the idea that we're self-contained, there's a hard line between us and the rest of the world, and we're rational beings. We decide what is in our own best interest and we pursue it freely. And then there's the kind of the more pre-modern view, the pre-scientific revolution view, which is that of the porous self. And the idea that actually we are much more influenced by what's around us. And that includes influenced by things that exist in an immaterial, or at least maybe perhaps an other dimensional kind of space. And we, on the left and right, all of us, and the sort of non-political, need to basically be, I think, guarding our souls a little bit. And the reason I bring this up with reference to conservatism is that I think that there are some very concerning trends. And you see it maybe emboldened with Trump's victory. There's a kind of casual cruelty that is increasingly celebrated. And so I think it's a mimetic reaction. And they might say it's justified. This is just a mirror image of what the left has been doing to us. We're now going to do to them or whatever. But this is corrupting your soul. And at a certain point, whether or not you're right doesn't matter nearly so much as whether you're good. And so I think there's a real moral peril that is facing people on all sides here that we need to be more attuned to. I don't know where it comes from, but I at some point encountered this phrase and like to use it, which is that people don't have ideas as much as ideas have people. And I think there's something to this, because why is it that if you know someone's belief on one issue, you can usually pretty accurately infer their beliefs about a huge range of totally unrelated things? And I wonder, is it because there's actually a kind of system that they are now under the influence of, a system of ideas with agency?
Love it. This is David Walsh from Priority of the Person. And he says this about concepts. He said, we don't come to concepts to figure out reality. He said, concepts are how reality is organized, and that's the reality in which we exist. And his quote is here on page 97. Where previously we had been inclined to assume that the concepts we used had originated within ourselves as a means of mastering the reality confronting us, now we are forced to acknowledge that such concepts constitute the reality within which we exist, and we can never hope to master in the slightest. And then he goes on to say the common good, the term used all the way back to the res publica, is one example. And he says, we do not possess the concept of the common good. It is rather that the common good possesses us. And so he ties it back to the common good. But it's just what you were saying. I think we've got the ideas of our concepts versus concepts as a reality inverted. And so therefore we're now not open to ideas with agency.
Yes,
Yeah.
but we in fact are very open to them because we're actually very porous. We're just
Yes.
unaware
Yes.
of our condition of being influenced. And I can ground what I said earlier a bit. This became very vividly apparent to me during COVID. And I think I have a public record of this, I was very skeptical of almost every public health intervention that was pursued. And that's just because I have certain heuristics, and one of my heuristics is I think you should keep humanity human. And COVID to me was just such a stark example of the people who want to put masks to cover our faces and inject us with strange mRNA vaccines and shut down funerals, the observation of funeral rites, and all of this. This seems like the side that is not human. These are the death of human ritual and face-to-face interaction. And so that was my position. But I found during COVID, and we forget this, I think we've memory holed a lot of this. But I just remember how absolutely vicious people were towards people who had not been vaccinated, incapable of a discursive dialogue about natural immunity, for example. I had the personal experience of being shouted at by people I knew closely who were in tears, pounding on tables, yelling about there's no such thing as natural immunity.
Yeah.
And I would overhear people in cafes boasting about how they ended friendships because so-and-so was dirty and unvaccinated in like wealthy, affluent parts of Calgary.
Yeah.
Listening to people calling their friends dirty for not being vaccinated. Like, it was insane. And I think that this is a form of political and philosophical evil.
Yeah.
But then you had the mirror image of it on the right, or not just the right, but I think there was some overlap there with kind of political sensibilities, where some people also experienced a kind of madness because they felt, understandably, that they were being persecuted. They were. But they were feeling persecuted. They were equally aggrieved. They were equally convinced that they were absolutely right and would brook no opposition to their position. They were equally adamant sometimes in demonizing their opponents on these issues. And so even though I sympathize much more with the arguments of one side, I think one side was much more correct than the other. The effect on the souls of those individuals was the same. And so that's what I say, that we need to be very much on guard against kinds of things, especially as we seem to be churning and churning in the widening gyre. How do we maintain our bearings? How do we maintain in us a certain kind of simplicity and openness and goodness, even in times where things seem increasingly unmoored?
That openness to, you're really asking people to be open to the unknown. And that's the opposite of certainty. And to your point, there was pursuit of certainty both directions, both to the left and the right. When you said impact on people's souls, it reminded me of Winston Churchill's comments about how what they were asking the soldiers to do in India was making those soldiers useless for any other service when they came home. They had done such atrocities that we couldn't depend on them to be normal humans when they came back. COVID, I got vaccinated. I thought I was helping my elderly patients. I took 3 vaccines, which was 3 more than I would have wanted to take. In hindsight, that was, I think, a mistake. I suspected it was a mistake, but I convinced myself that, no, I'm helping all my elderly people that I'm seeing, and I don't want to make them sick. But I was on record saying, the non-pharmacologic things that are being done, the masking, the distancing, the closing down, there's no evidence for these and for this. And I lost a lot of friends because of that. Made a lot of new friends though too on all these secret chat groups. But I wanted to mention, you mentioned Charles Taylor. I didn't realize he actually ran for the federal NDP party. He's a major leftist. But he says too, I like his comment about mimesis and poesis, whether you're creating reality on your own or you're actually learning about reality and copying it. How can we land this plane? I think I'll ask you for your thoughts on this. I'll rephrase that. Scruton said it this way, and I love repeating this all the time. He said, conservative intellectuals are people who find reasons for people who don't need reasons. So a lot of people are instinctively conservative. We want to protect what we love. We have a sense of what we know we love and what we know we want to protect, even if we can't articulate it. And that might apply to a favorite camping spot or a favorite family event or a favorite experience restaurant. You get the idea. Book.
Having a high trust society.
Yes. Yeah. And I think we need now more than ever to demonstrate, first of all, that conservatism and liberalism are 2 different things, that we're not trying to do this to create a purity test or a checklist of whether or not people are heretics or not within the conservative camp. That's not the objective, but rather to attract people to think more deeply about these more profound questions like you opened with.
One, this is where I do like free speech and truth-seeking and persuasion. I think that there's an opportunity there. for at least for people who are curious. You're right that part of it is schools. I don't know if you've read in Voegelin's Order and History, his volume on Plato and Aristotle.
I think I have.
Such a good time. Like if ever you just want to feel like you need to hang out with friends, read Vogelin writing about Plato. And it's so lovely. But even in his kind of opening description of Plato's life, he described the challenge he faced, which was Plato had a passion, and Confucius is a really interesting historical. Confucius was very much the same. Had a kind of mythical belief, almost quasi-mythical belief that he was put on earth to set right the symbols of the moral order, to rectify a society that was a civilization that was undergoing kind of moral and spiritual and intellectual collapse, and to revive it. Both tried their hands at politics. And Confucius famously just spent his days wandering around looking for a kingdom that would entrust him with some political power, and he had a kind of a cabinet in waiting that would help him execute this. And he never got the chance, and more often than not would have to flee assassination attempts because I think his competence tended to cast the existing rulers in negative relief. But Plato also tried politics briefly and found this is actually not the way to improve things, because the hour is too late, basically. You can't rectify the state when you're depending on people whose souls have been malformed by it over generations already. It would take a really heroic effort on the part of those people to somehow make themselves fit for that task. And so he started an academy. It was instead try then to form the kind of people who will be qualified for this task generations hence. But there is also something, I think, this is why a lot of what I'm currently interested in is I think there's something more disarming about approaching people from the perspective of, I'm going to cut through the noise of partisan concerns and actually let's talk about the spiritual dimension. It's not political, it's human, and I think that people who have an openness to it will be able to hear some of that. So that's why I think maybe it's disarming a little bit to say, actually, let's talk about the numinous. Let's talk about the ultimate ends of our life and where we're going after this.
Yeah, myth and spirit. Yeah. That's a great way to bring the plane to ground. Fantastic. I am very grateful for the time you've spent with us today, Caylan, and I wish you all the best of success on 3 more schools in the next 2 years.
Thank you, Shawn.